Russia's artillery commanders spent 3 years building a doctrine around one assumption. That assumption just died. In the last 60 days, something arrived on Ukrainian soil from a country that was not even a NATO member 2 years ago, and it is already rewriting the rules of how this war is fought at the most fundamental level. We are not talking about more shells. We are not talking about another Western howitzer that needs a crew of 8 and 10 minutes to set up. We are talking about a system so automated, so lethal, and so fast that Russian counter-battery radar cannot acquire the firing position before the crew is already gone. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because what we are covering today is not a headline story. This is the kind of development that gets buried under daily casualty counts and ceasefire speculation, but which will determine how this war actually ends. This channel exists to give you the analysis that mainstream coverage either cannot or will not provide. Today, that means breaking down exactly what Sweden just sent Ukraine, why it matters so profoundly, and what it tells us about the direction of this war in the months ahead. Here is what I am going to show you. First, we are going to look at the Archer artillery system, what it actually is, what it does, and why its capabilities are categorically different from anything else Ukraine has fielded. Second, we are going to examine how Sweden's arrival as a full NATO member fundamentally changed the calculus of what kind of weapons Kyiv can now receive. Third, we are going to walk through what Russian counter-battery doctrine looks like, and why the Archer system specifically destroys it at a technical level. Fourth, we are going to discuss the second-order effects, what this means for Russian manpower strategy, for the front lines in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, and for Putin's ability to sustain a grinding war of attrition. And finally, we are going to be honest about what this system cannot do, because that honesty is what separates serious analysis from hype. By the time we are done, you will understand why this transfer is not just a weapons delivery. It is a statement about where this war is heading. Let us start with why artillery has defined this war from the very beginning, and why that context is essential for understanding what Sweden's decision actually means. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Western analysts expected a rapid conventional collapse followed by an insurgency. What happened instead was a return to industrial-age attritional warfare that nobody in Brussels or Washington had genuinely prepared for. The front lines settled. The trenches appeared, and both sides began burning through artillery ammunition at rates that shocked defense establishments across the NATO alliance. At the height of fighting in the Donbass in mid-2022, Ukraine was firing between 6,000 and 8,000 artillery shells per day. Russia was firing between 40,000 and 60,000. That gap was not just a number. It was the reason Ukrainian positions at Sievierodonetsk and Lysychansk eventually fell. Shells per day is not a statistic in this war. It is a survival metric. The Western response was to surge legacy systems, the M777 lightweight howitzer from the United States, the Caesar-wheeled self-propelled gun from France, the Panzerhaubitze 2000 from Germany, the AS-90 from the United Kingdom. These were genuine contributions, and they mattered. But they all operated within the same basic paradigm. A crew deploys the system, levels it, loads the ammunition manually or semi-manually, fires a mission, and then relocates to avoid counter-battery fire. The timeline from arrival to first shot ranges from 3 to 10 minutes depending on the system and the terrain. And that timeline is a vulnerability window that Russian counter-battery radar has learned to exploit with devastating precision. Russia's primary counter-battery system is the Zoopark 1M, a sophisticated radar capable of tracking incoming shell trajectories and calculating the firing position with enough accuracy to direct return fire within 90 seconds of a shell leaving the barrel. Western systems have compensated for this through shoot-and-scoot tactics, firing a small number of rounds and moving before the counter-battery response arrives. But even the most disciplined crew needs time. And in that time, Russian MSTAS howitzers and Tornado G multiple rocket launchers have destroyed a significant number of Western-supplied artillery pieces. This is the problem that Sweden just solved. Sweden is not a country that historically drew much attention in the context of military hardware exports. For most of the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, Stockholm maintained a posture of armed neutrality, building capable forces for national defense, but carefully managing arms transfers to avoid entanglement in regional conflicts. That changed in stages. The war in Ukraine accelerated it dramatically, and Sweden's accession to NATO in March 2024, after more than 200 years of non-alignment, completed the transformation. As a full NATO member, Sweden is no longer navigating the diplomatic tensions that constrained its earlier assistance. Stockholm is now operating within a collective defense framework, and that means the constraints on transferring its most capable systems have largely dissolved. Sweden's defense industry is genuinely world-class in ways that are not always appreciated outside specialist circles. BAE Systems, Hägglunds, the Swedish defense manufacturer, produces the CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle, which multiple NATO armies consider among the best in its class. Swedish firm Saab produces the Gripen fighter, the Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, the RBS-70 air defense system, and a range of sensor and electronic warfare technologies that punch well above their price point. And then there is the Archer. The Archer is the system that changes the conversation entirely. Formerly designated the FH-77BW L-52, the Archer is a fully automated 155mm self-propelled howitzer mounted on a Volvo 6x6 truck chassis. The Swedish Army fielded it as its primary artillery piece, and after years of political debate about whether to transfer it to Ukraine, Stockholm has now made the decision. Multiple sources within the Swedish defense establishment, confirmed by reporting from Defense News and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, have indicated that Archer systems are now operating in Ukrainian hands. What follows is an analysis of exactly why that matters. Let us start with the technical reality of what the Archer actually does, and why every capability it possesses is specifically designed to defeat the Russian counter-battery doctrine Ukraine has been fighting against for 3 years. The Archer fires a 155mm NATO standard projectile. That matters because it means interoperability with the vast stockpile of Western ammunition that has been flowing into Ukraine. But the projectile compatibility is almost the least interesting thing about this system. Here is what makes the Archer different. From the moment the vehicle stops moving to the moment the first round leaves the barrel is approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds. The Panzerhaubitze 2000, which is widely regarded as one of the best self-propelled howitzers in the world, requires approximately 2 to 3 minutes to come into action from a road march. The M109 Paladin, the backbone of American artillery, requires 4 to 5 minutes. The Archer does it in 30 seconds. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a fundamental change in the risk calculus for every artillery mission. Here is what those 30 seconds mean in practice. Russia's Zoopark 1M counter-battery radar acquires a firing position approximately 60 to 90 seconds after a shell leaves the barrel. By the time the radar has calculated the firing coordinates and passed that information to Russian guns, by the time those guns have oriented on the target and begun their own firing solution, the Archer is already moving. It is already down the road. It is already behind a tree line or inside a village or 2 kilometers away from where it fired. The counter-battery shell arrives at a position that is empty. The crew is safe. The gun is intact, and it can stop, set up, fire again, and be moving within another 90 seconds total. The system achieves this through a degree of automation that has no real parallel in any artillery piece Ukraine has previously operated. The loading system is fully robotic. There is no manual ramming of shells, no separate propellant handling by a crew member standing exposed at the breech. The crew of 3, a driver, a commander, and a systems operator, manages the entire process from inside the armored cab. The gun layers itself using an inertial navigation system tied to GPS positioning. The ballistic computer calculates the firing solution automatically based on target coordinates received digitally. The crew inputs the mission data. The system does the rest. Magazine capacity is 21 rounds ready to fire, with the ability to execute multiple rounds impact, sending multiple shells in succession that all arrive on target simultaneously, at a rate of up to 8 rounds per minute. Think about what that means for a Russian position that has become accustomed to identifying incoming fire and taking cover. 8 rounds per minute, arriving nearly simultaneously on target, from a system that will be gone before the last shell lands. According to a 2023 technical assessment published by the Royal United Services Institute in London, the Archer's combination of deployment speed, sustained rate of fire, and displacement speed creates a counter-battery vulnerability window that is approximately 70 to 80% shorter than comparable systems, 70 to 80% shorter. That is not an incremental advantage. That is a different category of survivability. Now let us move from what the Archer does to what it means for specific Russian operational realities on the current front line. Russia has spent the last 18 months pursuing a strategy that Zaluzhny, Ukraine's former commander-in-chief, described accurately as a war of attrition. Putin's calculation has been straightforward. Russia has more people than Ukraine. Russia has more time than Western political will can sustain. Russia has more artillery ammunition than Ukraine can match without unlimited Western resupply. If Russia grinds slowly enough, one of those asymmetries will eventually prove decisive. That strategy depends on a specific operational method. Russian infantry, many of them mobilized convicts or desperate conscripts, advance in small groups toward Ukrainian trenches. They absorb casualties at rates that would be politically unacceptable in any democratic country. They draw Ukrainian defensive fire. Ukrainian artillery responds. Russian counter-battery fire locates Ukrainian guns. Ukrainian guns are destroyed or suppressed. The Russian infantry exploits the resulting gap. Rinse and repeat, kilometer by kilometer, across a 400-kilometer front. This is not elegant. It is not particularly sophisticated. But it has been working, slowly, in places like Avdiivka and Robotyne and along the Kherson Oblast contact line. The arithmetic of the grind has been favorable enough to keep Russian advances, however slow, moving forward. The Archer disrupts this arithmetic at the artillery suppression stage, which is the hinge on which the entire Russian operational method turns. Here is the sequence. A Russian assault group moves toward a Ukrainian defensive position. Ukrainian forward observers call in artillery coordinates. Previously, that call would go to an M777 crew, or a Caesar crew that needed 2 to 4 minutes to get into action, execute the mission, and displace. In that window, Russian counter-battery systems were either already tracking potential firing positions or could respond quickly enough to threaten the gun after it fired. Ukrainian artillerymen were making a calculated risk every single time they fired a mission. With the Archer, that risk calculation changes entirely. The gun can be pre-positioned closer to the front because its displacement speed eliminates the buffer distance Ukrainian crews needed to buy escape time. The fire mission executes faster, meaning Russian infantry receives fires before it can consolidate a position it has rushed into. The gun is moving before Russian counter-battery systems can develop a firing solution. And because the crew operates entirely from inside the cab, the physical exhaustion that degrades crew performance over extended operations is dramatically reduced compared to manual loading systems. According to battlefield reporting from military, a Ukrainian defense publication with credible access to frontline units, the psychological effect on Ukrainian artillery crews who have trained on modern self-propelled systems is significant. Crews who have operated under constant threat of counter-battery fire develop a defensive mentality that limits the aggression and creativity of their fire missions. A system that demonstrably outpaces the counter-battery threat does not just improve physical survivability. It restores offensive confidence to artillery operations that have been fought defensively for too long. The second-order effect on Russian infantry is the part that genuinely changes the strategic picture. If Russian assault groups begin suffering higher attrition rates during the approach phase because Ukrainian artillery can now respond faster and survive longer, the mathematics of Putin's attrition strategy begin to erode. You cannot sustain a human wave approach if the waves are being broken before they reach the defensive line, and you cannot replace guns fast enough if they stop being destroyed. Let us now go one level deeper and examine what Sweden's Archer transfer signals about the broader direction of Western military assistance, because this is where the geopolitical consequences become genuinely significant. When Sweden joined NATO in March 2024, it was the culmination of a political transformation that would have seemed completely impossible 5 years earlier. Swedish non-alignment was not just a policy preference, it was a national identity, embedded in 2 centuries of avoiding entanglement in European wars. The decision to join NATO was a direct response to Russian aggression in Ukraine, and it was made with a clarity of strategic thinking that reflects a Swedish defense establishment that has been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of threat environment since 2014. What NATO membership means in practical terms for Ukraine is not just Swedish willingness to transfer weapons, it is the removal of the coordination friction that complicated earlier transfers. As a NATO member, Sweden participates in the alliance's Ukraine Defense Contact Group, the mechanism through which Western nations coordinate military assistance and deconflict capability gaps. Swedish military planners now sit in the same rooms as American, British, German, and Polish counterparts when the questions being asked are, what does Ukraine need, what do we have, and what are we willing to send? The Archer transfer did not happen in isolation. It is part of a broader Swedish military assistance package that has now exceeded 6 billion Swedish kronor in value, according to the Swedish government's official aid tracking. That package includes Carl Gustaf M4 anti-tank systems, RBS-70 NG man-portable air defense systems, CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, Gripen-compatible signals intelligence assets, and now the Archer. Sweden is not a country that is dipping its toe into Ukrainian support. Stockholm has committed its most capable systems. What Moscow will have noticed, and what the Kremlin's military planners will be deeply uncomfortable about, is what the Archer transfer represents as a precedent. If Sweden is willing to send its primary self-propelled howitzer, the system that underpins Swedish army firepower, other NATO members with similarly capable systems have less political cover for holding back. The transfer creates pressure. Germany's next-generation artillery, Finland's K9 Thunder fleet, Norway's M109 modernization program. These are all systems that NATO partners are now under greater political pressure to evaluate for Ukrainian transfer. Russia cannot match this trend. Russian domestic production of advanced artillery systems, particularly precision-guided munitions compatible with those systems, is under sustained pressure from sanctions regimes that have limited access to critical electronics and optical components. According to a January 2026 assessment from the Kyiv School of Economics, Russian artillery ammunition production has increased, but remains heavily dependent on Iranian-supplied drone-delivered munitions and North Korean artillery shell imports to supplement domestic output. That is not a sustainable industrial position for a country fighting a major land war. Now, intellectual honesty requires that we discuss what the Archer cannot do, and what uncertainties remain about its operational impact in Ukraine's specific environment. The Archer is a remarkable system. It is not a war-winning system on its own. That distinction matters for responsible analysis. First, the question of numbers. Ukraine has not publicly confirmed the exact quantity of Archer systems transferred. Swedish defense reporting suggests the initial tranche is in the range of 6 to 12 units. For context, Ukraine operates an artillery force spread across a 400-kilometer contact line with multiple active axes. 6 to 12 Archer systems represent a significant capability enhancement, but they are not numerically sufficient to transform the entire artillery equation across all sectors simultaneously. The impact will be felt most acutely where Ukrainian commanders choose to concentrate the systems, and that concentration will create priority targets for Russian intelligence and strike assets. Second, the question of maintenance. The Archer is a highly sophisticated system. Its automated loading mechanism, its inertial navigation suite, and its digital fire control architecture all require trained maintenance personnel and a reliable supply of spare components. Ukraine has demonstrated remarkable skill at maintaining complex Western systems under combat conditions, but the Archer's complexity exceeds that of most systems currently in Ukrainian hands. Training pipelines and maintenance infrastructure will determine whether these systems remain operational at high rates or begin suffering availability issues within 3 to 6 months of deployment. Third, Russian adaptation cannot be discounted. Russia's military has shown throughout this war an ability to adapt tactically to new Western capabilities, even if that adaptation is often costly and slow. When Ukraine began fielding HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems in mid-2022, Russia initially suffered significant losses of ammunition depots and command posts that had been considered safely out of range. Within several months, Russian forces had dispersed their logistics architecture and adapted their operational security practices. The Archer's shoot-and-scoot advantage is real, but Russian intelligence may eventually develop tactics that attempt to pre-locate gun positions during movement phases, rather than relying solely on counter-battery radar. Fourth, the broader artillery ammunition supply question remains unresolved. The Archer can fire with extraordinary speed and survivability, but it still needs shells. Ukraine's artillery ammunition situation has improved significantly with the delivery of Czech-sourced ammunition purchased under a European-backed fund, and with the expansion of production commitments from South Korea and several European manufacturers. But the fundamental supply constraint that has limited Ukrainian fire missions throughout the conflict has not been permanently solved. A system with a 21-round magazine and an 8-round-per-minute burst capability can burn through ready ammunition faster than resupply chains can guarantee. These limitations are real. They should be discussed honestly, and they should not be used to dismiss the strategic significance of what Sweden has provided, because the significance is genuine, even accounting for these constraints. Here is the picture that emerges when you put all of this together, and here is why the title of this video is not hyperbole. Vladimir Putin's strategic theory of victory rests on a specific foundation: time. If Russia can continue making incremental territorial gains, even at enormous human cost, eventually Western political fatigue will limit Ukrainian military assistance, Ukrainian manpower will approach exhaustion, and the conditions for a negotiated settlement favorable to Moscow will emerge. That theory is not crazy. It is actually grounded in historical precedent about how democratic alliances manage extended conflicts. And for stretches of 2023 and 2024, it appeared to be working. The problem for Putin is that the Western alliance has not, in fact, tired in the way his theory predicted. It has adapted. Sweden is now in NATO. Finland is now in NATO. The European Union has created a dedicated artillery ammunition procurement fund. The UK-Ukraine Security Partnership, signed in January 2024, commits British military support for a decade. And Sweden has just sent its best howitzer to a country that Russia invaded with the expectation of defeating in 72 hours. The Archer transfer is not a single data point. It is a signal within a pattern, and the pattern says something that Russian strategic planners must find deeply uncomfortable. The Western commitment to Ukraine's survival is not decreasing. It is institutionalizing. It is embedding itself in treaty structures, procurement agreements, training pipelines, and now in the transfer of first-line capabilities that NATO allies were previously reluctant to part with. Russia is running a military operation with growing logistical dependence on North Korean shells and Iranian drones, against a country that is now receiving first-class Swedish artillery systems, British air defense, American ATACMS, and French long-range missiles. That is not an equation that moves in Moscow's favor over time. Putin knows this. His public statements have increasingly shifted from declarations of imminent victory to frameworks that justify why a long war is strategically acceptable. That is not the language of a leader who believes his war plan is proceeding as designed. That is the language of improvisation under pressure. The Archer arriving in Ukraine will not end this war next week, but it will make Ukrainian artillery crews more lethal, more survivable, and more operationally confident. It will erode the effectiveness of Russian counter-battery operations in the sectors where it is deployed. It will force Russian assault commanders to revise their approach timelines and their risk calculations, and it will add one more data point to the pattern that Sweden, like Finland, like the Baltic states, like Poland, has decided that Russian military power is a threat that must be stopped now, with real weapons, not managed with carefully calibrated half measures. Watch for the sectors where Ukraine concentrates the Archer systems in the coming weeks. Watch for any changes in Russian assault patterns in those sectors. Watch for Russian strike attempts against logistics routes in the regions where these guns are operating, because those strikes will tell you that Russian intelligence has taken the threat seriously and is trying to disrupt the supply chain before the tactical impact becomes undeniable. This channel will be tracking all of it. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and we will be back with the next piece of this story as it develops. The analysis is just getting started.